Hello, I'm Dr. Kelly Bost. I am a professor in the Department of Human and Community Development at the University of Illinois in Champaign, Urbana. And today, what I want to talk to you guys about is the role of emotion regulation in pediatric obesity. And I like to ask people in the beginning, first of all, if you've ever noticed the different relationships in your life and how people respond to distress. Some people, for example, tend to just be really laid back and accept the challenges and have very little overt responses. Whereas other people that you might know, children and adults, they may become really hyperactivated and respond in very exaggerated ways. Well, it turns out that this particular developmental phenomenon called emotion regulation is an important skill, and it's developed over time, and there are different influences on emotion regulation. And it also turns out that these skills are important in the development of pediatric obesity. What is it about these processes for pediatric obesity? Well, the first one is that, if you've ever noticed, is that we have a tendency to self-regulate our eating. And that depends on satiety cues and hunger cues that our body gives us. These signals and cues are automatic on a daily basis, but also they're affected by distress and environmental factors. And we also know that the brain regions that govern energy balance are also implicated in emotion regulation and stress responses. We also know that the inability to regulate emotions can lead to emotional overeating, and I think that most of us have experienced that, when you're really stressed and you grab for the snack food or whatever automatically. These particular patterns can develop really early in life, and so it's important. So it's not only that emotion regulation can influence some of these brain processes and autonomic and automatic processes, but also with respect to our behavior and eating patterns. Because we want to look at the factors that are involved in the development of pediatric obesity from early on, we have to look at some of the developmental phenomena that we already know about that have influences on emotion regulation. And there's two in particular that we're going to talk about. The first one is child characteristics. So what do children bring into the situation? Individual differences in child characteristics. And we're going to talk about, in particular, child temperament as one of those child characteristics. But we also know that as soon as children are born, they're born into relationships, right? And they are interacting with individuals in their environment on a daily basis. And so those types of interactions are ways in which infants learn how to regulate everyday challenges, right, by the responses that the parents have, right? So those are two different influences we're going to talk about. So what is child temperament? When we talk about temperament or the child characteristics, these are individual differences with respect to reactivity and regulation in the domains of attention, so attention allocation, emotionality, which we'll focus more on today, and motor activity. Those are the phenotypic expressions of temperament. But a lot of times developmentalists like to describe it as a characteristic way of behaving. So if you have had experiences with children and families, you understand that some children, may get really upset, right, when you change from one activity to another, whereas other children, you can just easily make those transitions. We can say that it's a predisposition to behave in a certain way, given the stimuli. So what are the primary dimensions of temperament, child temperament? Reactivity is one of them, and this is the arousability of motor activity, affective, autonomic, central nervous system, and endocrine processes. The other one is self-regulation that develops a little bit later, and this is the capacity to modulate reactivity and inhibit reactivity. And this involves attention. You have to allocate attention to regulate certain situations. Approach, behavioral approach and withdrawal. Some children readily go into a new situation or a group of individuals, whereas other children might withdraw. Behavioral approach and withdrawal, inhibition, and self-soothing. So basically, how reactive children are and then the capacity to regulate after becoming distressed or in that situation. So how do we measure this in young children? We can't, as with adults, we can't go and give a survey and say, how upset are you with the situation, or how do you deal, with your emotions and on a regular basis. So there are different assessments of a temperament. Some are simple self-reports from parents where they fill out questionnaires, and parents know their children pretty well. And parent reports tend to be pretty valid. And we ask parents things like, is your child easily soothed when they're upset, or do they tend to become distressed when you make them change from one activity to another? But we also have laboratory procedures. As developmentalists, we like to get multiple methods to assess some of these behaviors. So we have children come with their parents come into the lab, and we give them certain tasks to do to see how much they persevere, to see how frustrated they get, to a particular task, and then those particular behaviors are coded for reactivity and regulation. We also look at EEG, brain activity, or ERPs, to look at the frontal asymmetries and the processing of emotion during certain tasks. And you can see here on the pictures some children with electrodes, and these are important for looking at the particular brain processes and in reactivity and regulation. So what are some of the dimensions of reactivity? We have reactivity and we have regulation. And so what would we look at? These are just some examples of different constructs that we use and the way in which we assess them. Negative emotionality, for example, we would ask, did the baby seem sad when the caregiver was gone? Difficult temperament, the infant is fussy on going to sleep and waking up. Emotionality, the child gets upset easily. Negative mood, the infant is fussy on a regular basis. Fearful, how often during the last week did the baby startle to a certain loud noise? Because some babies startle really easy and other babies don't. For regulation, we have orienting responses, like how often a baby stared at a particular stimulus or object. You can use eye tracking devices or time spent looking. Self-control, when you give a child that comes into the lab a desired toy and ask them not to touch it until you get back. That's one way to look at, impulse control, right? So motion regulation, put a toy in a clear box that the child can't get to, and so how much how much time do they spend on the task, and then also how frustrated. Persistence, how soothed, if they're really upset, how easily can they be soothed, and then inhibitory control, which is really important. So the ability to suppress a response. An inappropriate approach response. So when you ask them to lower their voice, can they do that? This has real life implications, and go to any kindergarten class and ask the teacher what are some of the, the most important behaviors for children to have when they come in. And it's not necessarily knowing the alphabet. It's usually like how to, behave in a group and how to follow directions and how to have impulse control. And so these skills are important. Is it really genetic? Right? Well, there is evidence. So we have evidence that it is genetic from animal studies. Strains of animals can be produced that are very fearful, that are very aggressive. We have behavioral genetic studies. So the estimates of heritability generally fall between 0.2 and 0.6. With twin studies. Molecular genetic studies have looked at, in particular, dopamine receptor genes and serotonin transporter genes. And finally, we know that children's temperament is related to HPA axis functioning, distress reactivity, how your body normally responds to distress and cortisol production in your body. So we know that there's all this evidence that there is a highly genetic component to this. But how is it related to pediatric obesity, right? I mean, that's one of the things that we're talking about today. So there are just these developmental phenomena I'm talking about today are just now being incorporated into the studies of pediatric obesity, because most of the studies traditionally, and rightly so, have been focused on eating patterns and nutrition and parenting styles of feeding. But we know now that there's evidence that there's a relation between child temperament and obesity or obesity-related behaviors. There's a review article that was done recently that showed that for the dimension of negative reactivity, there were 3 longitudinal studies and 3 or 4 cross-sectional studies that showed significant associations between early infant temperament and later obesity or obesity-related behaviors. So that's for the dimension of negative reactivity. And it tended to be primarily the dimension of distress to limitation, so how distressed individuals get when they're constrained. Regulation, also that dimension of temperament, there have been studies that have shown all the 4 longitudinal studies show that there was a significant association between early temperament and later obesity. The particular behaviors that were found to be important or dimensions of temperament were self-control, delay of gratification, where you can actually wait, to get a particular a toy or object, and emotion regulation, which is the one that we're focusing on today, the capacity to regulate the negative affect. The outcomes have been different across studies, so BMI, weight gain, and actual measured adiposity. Okay, so we know that temperament, which is a very important developmental phenomenon, it's been shown to be related to all kinds of outcomes in social domains and cognitive domains, but now we're finding it with obesity too. But as I said before, children are born into the world and automatically are interacting with adults and other people, right? And so parent-child relationships are extremely important for the development of the capacity to regulate emotion. Attachment theory in particular has been around for a really long time and has been shown to be related to the development of certain patterns of emotion regulation in children. So, and it explains, and that's important, we need this theoretical framework for explaining the development of different emotion regulation and self-regulatory strategies in response to negative events. Attachment is a theoretical framework primarily for close relationships. But when we talk about pediatric obesity, eating occurs in an interpersonal context, and usually, in family dinners, and so that's important to look at too, as some of these interpersonal contexts. The normative aspects of attachment theory are important because it's considered to be universal. In other words, we find this in animals and as well as humans, that all children are born with an attachment system that is activated when the child is distressed or otherwise needs help. And so when this attachment system, it's a physiological system, is activated, the child seeks proximity toward the caregiver, right? And this is a wonderful thing to have, to be born with, because it promotes our survival, right? So when you're distressed, you seek proximity to the person that can help you, hopefully. You see this at parks all the time when you go and, a parent may be sitting on a bench and reading a book, and the child is crawling and reaching out a little bit, and then, venturing out, exploring, and then, a stranger walks by or a dog comes up, and then the child, scurries back to the parent and maybe, puts their hand on the leg, right? And then, the parent says, oh, it's okay, and then they go back out and they come back in, right? This phenomena is called secure base behavior. So the child is using the parent as a secure base. It's like, it's okay, so I can go explore the world. And when the child becomes fearful, the attachment system is activated, so they seek proximity. That's the normative aspect of the theory, but there's also an individual difference aspect of the theory, that the quality of the attachment relationship depends on how the parent responds to a child's bid for proximity, for support, or for help or interaction, and that makes sense. So for example, a secure attachment is when the parent is consistent and responsive to the child's signals and cues. And obviously in early childhood, this is relevant for feeding, right? When the child cries when they're hungry. Is a parent responsive? Usually parents learn pretty quickly, the different cries that their babies have. That's a hunger cry or that's a tired cry, right? Insecure attachment, caregivers are either inconsistent, so sometimes they're responsive, sometimes they're not. And usually what happens is these children develop patterns of emotional responding that we call insecure, resistant, or ambivalent. Or parents are just actively dismissing of their children's distress or bids for contact. And those children tend to develop what we call an insecure avoidant attachment relationship. So when they become adults, for example, these individuals are more likely to dismiss negative emotion and withdraw. And we've seen, this has been decades and decades of research that has looked at this. So the history of the interaction results in expectations, especially over the first year of life, results in expectations, right? That the self is worthy of care and trust and that the needs will be met. And so therefore, like I said before, there's a sense of felt security. So the child feels free to explore the world and to learn from that. The resulting emotion regulation response patterns are either security, you have emotional flexibility, you can talk about negative emotions, right, without becoming hyperactivated or highly anxious. And you're flexible, right? You can talk about them and without coming overly distressed. Insecurity, either you suppress or minimize negative affect, or you have overly intense or emotional responses because you're anxious about, the availability of the other person. Clearly, in attachment has implications for adult relationships as well, where you see patterns of, individuals either withdrawing or becoming, very hypervigilant to being abandoned or rejected. So how do we measure attachment in early childhood? Well, there's a standard lab procedure that's done for children who are up to about 1.5 or 2. It's called the Ainsworth Strain Situation Procedure. And that's where children and parents come to the lab and they come into a room and there's toys, and then a stranger comes in, and then you see how the baby responds. Usually they seek proximity, or they may just look, and because the mom's still there, are they using the parent as a secure base, right? Are they still exploring? Are they touching base? And then the parent leaves and the baby's there with the stranger. And then everyone leaves, and then you watch the behavior patterns of the child when the parent leaves and when the parent returns. And what you're looking for is proximity seeking for secure children, and then being readily soothed by the parent. So insecure, especially insecure avoidant children, tend to be more soothed by the stranger than they are the parent. And this procedure has been around for a very long time, developed by Mary Ainsworth after her initial studies in Uganda with Ganda women. She came back and tested those and tested Bowlby's theory. We also do home observations with children, especially when they're older, because in their everyday interactions, if you stay long enough, you see the secure-based behavior. If the child goes out to play and then gets tired and comes back and touches base, and then some of these same kind of behaviors. And there's procedures and protocols for analyzing that. So what do we know? Why is that important? Because we have shown, or several studies, including some of the work that we're doing in the ITOP program, have found that significant associations between children's attachment relationships and later obesity. So for example, there's one study that has shown that attachment security in the first year of life or over the first couple of years in life predicts, obesity at age 15. And that's controlling for, socioeconomic status and, other demographic variables and temperament, But, unfortunately, a lot of these studies haven't looked at attachment and temperament together, right? Because they both play a role. Because parents learn how to respond to their children also for children with different temperaments, right? So, and so some of the more recent studies have looked at the combination of attachment security and child temperament in the prediction of obesity. And what they found is that there's joint effects, that either there's a moderating effect, which means that, temperament, influences obesity, but only for children who are insecure, right? And some have shown joint unique effects, so they both uniquely predict obesity-related outcomes. What's missing, and maybe something that you guys may want to think about, are evidence for the mechanisms for this, because these studies are relatively new. In the study of pediatric obesity, we don't have a lot of good evidence for those mechanisms. Thank you.